Good afternoon. Hope you are all well and able to deal with the new situation we found ourselves in. Last time I asked you to watch a video. It's a bit long, but this person, I mean the speaker, I know him personally, and um, I don't choose videos randomly. This person is an authority in the field of criticism, especially neoclassical criticism. So I wanted you to listen to what he says. Of course, you are not required to know every bit he mentioned, and that's why I'm doing this lecture. So there are just major points that I want you to understand, but I wanted you to listen to the way we criticize authors, to the way we analyze their contribution. So this person is an authority. Try to listen to him whenever you find time. The subject of the video is the neoclassical writer's attitude towards the ancients. And I told you that they are called neoclassical because they use the style and subject matter of classical writers. So this applies to them all, but he's trying to discuss the differences between Samuel Johnson and Pope in relation to their attitude towards the ancients. So he mentions how Pope, in comparison with Johnson, with Samuel Johnson, supported a strict adherence to the characteristics of antiquity. So Pope supported the adherence to the features of antiquity. He wanted writers to exactly follow the art of antiquity, to follow authors like Homer, especially in relation to classical unities. That's the unity of action, time, and place. Classical unity, let me just tell you what is classical unity about, just briefly. So classical unities are the unity of action, time, and place. That place should have one that the play or the text should have one principal action. That action should occur over a particular period of time and should occur in a single location. That's the concept of classical unities. So according to Pope, we or writers should adhere to that, to the classical unities and to the features of antiquity in general. And there is a bit of prejudice. The speaker, the video comments on how there is a bit of prejudice, which means that Pope treats ancient writers or classical writers as the standard, and that all writers should follow them. However, Samuel Johnson believes that we should acknowledge the context. By the context, he means the time and consequences of the text. So a text written in 16th or 17th century is different from a text written before the birth of the Christ in Greek, in the Greek civilization. So Samuel Johnson believes that we should acknowledge the context, and we shouldn't ask writers to adhere strictly to the classical features of writing. So a writer can, of course, make use of classical features, but he shouldn't adhere to them strictly. And he gives the example of Shakespeare, 16th century Renaissance writer, who doesn't stick fully to the Homeric tradition. And what Johnson says is that this is okay if Shakespeare doesn't stick fully to the Homeric tradition. That's fine, because Shakespeare is a poet of reality. He provides us with characters who are human beings. So the characters in Shakespeare's literature are human beings. They are not heroes with supernatural abilities. They are not like Achilles. They're not like Odysseus. They're not gods. So they are ordinary human beings. So this is one factor that we need to take into consideration when assessing Shakespeare's adherence to classical features. So because he is portraying real characters, ordinary people, he can't do the same as Homer, who provides us with heroes, with gods and goddesses, with supernatural heroes who can do everything. However, so Samuel Johnson and the speaker of in the video mentions this. What is good about Samuel Johnson as a critic is that he points out to the positive and negative points. So he doesn't only focus on the negative points, but also the positive. For example, yes, this is what he said about Shakespeare, but he also criticized Shakespeare for certain points, like for his gross jokes, that his poetry is full of jokes, his writing is full of jokes, and he criticized Shakespeare for that. He also criticized Shakespeare for his flowery language. In his opinion, Shakespeare's language is not serious. And he also suggests that his writing should be, his texts should be longer because they are worthy, they are sublime, so they should be longer. Well, that's Samuel Johnson's opinion. So he's a critic, but another critic might come and say, oh, the gross jokes Shakespeare presenting us with are the major reason for his success. So all I want you to know about the video is this, what I have just mentioned. So the video is about the neoclassical writers' attitude toward ancients. He compares Pope and Samuel Johnson, focusing on Samuel Johnson and how he is a distinguished critic because he figures out the positive and the negative, not only focusing on the negative points, and how he gives the example of Shakespeare to explain his point about criticism and about the adherence to the classical features of writing. This is all what I want you to know about neoclassical literature. And I know you are thinking of that. So whatever I mentioned, whatever we discussed in the questions, in the class, in this video is included. So the things we haven't discussed won't be included. Given the time constraints, we're trying to give the most. We're trying to give we are trying to focus on the most important ideas. So I wanted you to know the most important ideas about neoclassical poetry, and what we got is enough. So the next period is the Romantic period. And what I will do now is a comparison and contrast between neoclassical poetry and Romantic poetry. So for now, we need to compare and contrast between neoclassical writers and Romantic writers. As we mentioned again and again, characteristics of neoclassical poetry. I'll repeat them just for you to know the differences between them and Romantic poetry. So neoclassical poets are poets like Dryden, Pope, and Johnson. They are very serious. So what are the characteristics of neoclassical writing in general? And we mentioned this many times, but I want to repeat them in order for you to be able to compare and contrast. So it's the focus on prose and on satire. That's a characteristic of neoclassical writing. It's known also as town poetry, urban. So the themes are urban, and here we mean they are not concerned with nature. They discuss themes like politics and philosophy. So the themes are serious. They are serious. They are discussing points related to politics and philosophy. The language also is complicated, elevated, and artificial. That's neoclassical poetry. So the language is elevated and complicated, sometimes artificial. The target, they are addressing, the poets, neoclassical poets, address the elite, the educated, the intellectual. They don't address the commoners. So the target is not the commoners. The target is the educated, the elite, and the intellectual. They also focused on the revolution in science and politics and the impact of this on poetry. So their poetry is serious, and they, in terms of language, as I said, the language is elevated, and also they followed strict meter and rhyme scheme, mainly the heroic couplet, because this style was borrowed from the classical writers. So these mainly are the features of neoclassical poetry. Now I want you to see the difference. Romantic poetry, and the major romantic poets are Wordsworth and Coleridge. Of course, we have Shelley, Keats, and Byron, but the major poets are Wordsworth, Coleridge, and also Blake. So romantic poetry rose as a reaction to neoclassical poetry. So it is a reaction to neoclassical poetry. There is a focus on the individual, not on communal issues, not on politics, not the major theme. You will find some romantic poets who discuss political ideas, but the major focus is the individual, not society. There is a great deal of imagination and intuition. So they believe in the importance of imagination and intuition instead of reason. So it's imagination in opposition to reason, intuition, emotions, in addition to the intellect. So we find in their poetry, we find supernatural elements, something that has to do with imagination. Also, simplicity is a major feature of romantic poetry. And you will notice that it's very obvious. Once you read a romantic poem, you will see how simple it is compared to neoclassical poetry. So it's very simple. The poetry is very simple, and the language is very simple. So simplicity is a feature of romantic poetry. There is also a focus, as I said, a focus on emotions instead of reason, instead of intellect. And they are less serious than the neoclassical poets. In terms of language, they use relaxed meter, which means that they don't stick to a certain rhyme scheme. Sometimes they just don't stick to a certain rhyme scheme. And we have free verse. In romantic poetry, we have free verse. And the focus, and that's a major idea, the focus is the commoners, not the elite. So the target of their poetry is the everyday man, the commoners. Of course, some poets are called transitional poets because they combine both elements from neoclassicism and elements from romanticism, like Blake. So he combined elements from neoclassical, he took the neoclassical form with a kind of sensitive spirit. So Blake is a transitional poet because he combines elements from both. Now, the Romantic movement, you should know that it refers to the development in art, literature, music, and philosophy, and it spans the late 18th century and early 19th. So late 18th till the early 19th century. Following Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and I know you know him, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Declaration of the Freedom of Man, major transitions took place in society. So Romantic poets were at the heart of this movement. They were inspired by the desire for liberty. So they are mainly concerned with the idea of freedom and liberty, and that's why they focused on the individual. That's why they addressed simple themes. They were against the conformity to rules and conventions. So they discussed ideas related to the exploitation of the poor, the importance of the individual. They challenged the need to follow conventions and rules. They renounced rationalism, and they focused on the importance of expressing personal feelings. As I said, major Romantic poets are Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, and Keats. And it was an age of revolution. All of these poets supported the French Revolution. Because they are pioneers of freedom and liberty. So they supported the French Revolution. Wordsworth, the major Romantic poet, was against elitist poetry, I mentioned this before. So he is against the poetry that is directed towards the elite, the educated only, and the intellectual. In his opinion, poetry and whose language and subject matter are not accessible to the ordinary people is not good poetry. In his opinion, poetry should address the concerns of ordinary people. So it should be democratic. It should be composed in everyday language. And that's why he gave voice to the marginalized groups like the poor, the rural, the soldiers, women, and children. You will notice how in his poetry the major point is always about either a child or a woman or a poor person or a soldier. So he gave voice to marginalized people. Blake also was radical in his political views. He supported the freedom in general. He addressed social issues, and he was concerned with monarchy and the church. So, in his opinion, the individual should be free from the hegemony of monarchy and the church. Also, you will notice that children are special to Romantic poets. So many poems were addressed to children or were about children. So because they, in their opinion, in their opinions, the Romantic poets, children enjoy special affinity with nature. That's why they are special. That's why they are concerned with them. And they also believe that nature is the great universal teacher. So nature is the god of the romantic. They always say nature is the god of the Romantic poets. Also, you need to know that female poets also contributed to the Romantic movement, but they tended to be less controversial. Dorothy Wordsworth is Wordsworth's sister. She was a good poet, but there was some limitation on women back then, and they were confined to the domestic sphere. You might say that women started to perform and to write as early as the 18th century, and that's right. That's true. Yes, they started, but the constraints on them remained there. So even in our time, women are not as free as they should be. So in the time of Dorothy Wordsworth, there were still some limitations on women writers. I also want to mention that the Gothic novel appeared. So as a reaction to the Enlightenment, the Gothic novel appeared. These are ideas we will discuss in relation to text. So as we discuss the texts, we will raise them, but I want you to know some ideas that are relevant to the Romantic period. The Byronic hero also appeared. The Byronic hero is a melancholic, rebellious hero who seemed to represent his generation. And for example, if we study Emily Bronte's novels, you will see this type of a hero. Heathcliff is an example of Byronic hero. Next time we will start with William Blake. And as we read, we'll compare and contrast neoclassical poetry with Romantic poetry. We'll start with the Chimney Sweeper, and his works were known for favoring imagination instead of reason, especially that he wanted to become a painter. So that's that's the reason. So he is more of an imaginative poet than realistic poet, and he is known as a visionary poet also, who writes about actual visions from God. So next time, please read about Blake and read his poems. We'll start by the Chimney Sweeper, and we'll discuss the romantic elements in his poetry, trying to compare them with neoclassical elements. So take care of yourself, study hard, don't forget about your paper, and please prepare. So next time we'll discuss romantic poetry in general and the poetry of Blake in particular.